Our next speaker is Neil Williams. He's an entomologist, pollination ecologist at the University of California, Davis in the entomology department. And he knows a lot about how arthropods do their thing out there. And he's applying that to avocados currently. And he's open to the general topic of pollination ecology, which he's going to cover today. So Neil, take it away.
All right, well, thanks, Ben, and thanks, Mary Lou, for the invitation to talk a little bit to people today. Important disclosure is that of probably everyone on the cafe meeting today, I am one of the newest to come to working in avocado. So I have a long career working on pollination and a lot of it in applied work with diversified agriculture in California, but not with avocado. So I'm going to talk a little bit about alternative pollinators in a general sense and focus some on an example of a study that highlights some of the direction that our team is hoping to be moving forward on over the next couple of years with avocado in the Central Coast area. And then I'll have some references to avocado, but Arnon luckily has done a really great job on introducing more of the details of avocado pollination, and I would direct most of your questions at the moment to him. We'll see where we get over the next few years. So I want to start by backing up and talking a little bit more generally about the role of pollinators in agriculture. Not a surprise to those of you working in the field, but our crop production, other than our primary cereal grains worldwide, are strongly dependent on pollinator visits. Anything essentially that we're harvesting and marketing as a fruit at some point resulted from a flower, and many of those are dependent to some degree on the pollination of mostly insects. And so that dependency varies from things like almonds, which are really fully dependent, to things that are more partially dependent, like cherry tomatoes, whose pollination benefits strongly in terms of fruit quality and fruit mass, but is not fully dependent. And so if we look at which insects are involved in that pollination, as Arnon mentioned, the workhorse, the cornerstone of agricultural pollination, because of numbers and management experience, really, and their flexibility as an organism that's social, living in manageable colonies, has been Apis mellifera, European honeybees that are moved around our agricultural systems, certainly in most regions, to pollinate different crops seasonally as they come into bloom. And then there's another proportion of pollination which, until the last decade or so, was relatively under-recognized, the role of wild, we'll call native pollinators, wild bees, flies, and some other insects, which also provide some of that pollination. And since Arnon has talked some about honeybees, I want to focus mostly on these other organisms. So a lot is known about wild bees, and increasing amount is known, but I think it's also important, particularly in the avocado context, to raise at least this issue of non-bee pollinators. And there's some recent summaries from studies worldwide looking at the role of other organisms. This is a figure that's relatively complex, showing on the bottom here all these different crops. Let me see if I can grab a pointer here. Yeah, all the different crops here from different regions of the world. The areas shaded in blue are relevant to managed honeybees and other native bees, and the part in yellow is related to fly pollination on those same crops. And again, this is sort of an overall summary of crops from different world regions. But you can see that there's a reasonable portion of pollination in the darker yellow by one group of flies, in particular the hover flies, the syrphid flies, and then other flies in the sort of lighter yellowish color there, and then other pollinators in the brown and orange colors. So there can be a role, and the photographs on the other side of the slide show examples of a variety of those flies, with the top two rows being non-syrphid flies, what we call flesh or blow flies, califorid flies, and other flies, and then all of the ones on the bottom being different groups of syrphid flies, the hover flies. If we look then just at avocado, there's also a really interesting recent review of the role of different kinds of pollinators and their effectiveness in different regions of avocado production. And I want to highlight two elements that have been looked at in particular. So the figure here on the right-hand side shows in each of these different regions of avocado production, and I'll make a nod towards Arnon and others on the call from Israel. It's unclear to me why there are not studies from Israel in this review, but I don't think there are. I didn't find why that is, and so maybe someone else knows that. But one of the interesting things you'll see here is just how variable the contribution of different insect groups is in terms of their the composition of visitors actually on avocado flowers in those groves. And so this is looking at percent abundance of all visitors, and it varies from some countries that seem to be very, very strongly dominated by honeybees, and in some of those, well, in all of the ones shown, honeybees are part of the native pollinator fauna as well as managed. And then it goes down, and I've highlighted California, where interestingly, the role of flies is potentially quite high, where hoverflies are sort of a co-dominant portion of the visitor fauna, and then wild bees make up a reasonable percentage as well. And if we add other Diptera, other flies as well as hoverflies, it's sort of a full 50% of visitation at the avocado flower. So you can imagine why there would be some interest in understanding those contributions a little bit better relative to what we know better about the contributions of honeybees. The panels on the left-hand side are really summaries of what has been looked at broadly internationally in terms of understanding the effectiveness of individual organisms from each of these different groups in terms of how well they pollinate or might pollinate. And I say might pollinate because in these cases, for this more diverse set of pollinators, in contrast to what we know about honeybees, we're mostly looking at proxies, not actual pollination, but proxies for what could be pollination and fruit set of the crop. So in the first panel, it's the numbers of pollen grains that are carried on the bodies of individual insects that are collected from avocado flowers or in the area of the flowering avocado. And you'll see wasps, stingless bees, in this case, flies of various sorts, honeybees, another fly, and then beetles, with quite a lot of variability. But what's noticeable is that this kind of figure is hard to read, but if you'll have to sort of take my word for it, but the distribution of pollen carried is actually relatively low, right? It's somewhere in the area of just tens to hundreds of grains, and then there are some organisms that are carrying large numbers, but that's sort of a relatively less frequent number. Again, not the actual pollination, but at least the potential, because the pollen is carried on the body of the organism. And then the other one, in order to have effective pollination, or what we consider a good pollinator, would be one that actually has a relatively rapid rate of flower visitation, how often they're moving from one flower to the next in terms of visitation rate. And you can imagine combining that panel with the panel over on the right-hand side to sort of understand what the total visitation would be. And again, we don't have the same data for all taxa. The panel on the top and the bottom don't fully match each other, but at least here we have some pretty good data from some places on these other bee pollinators in terms of how rapidly they're visiting among flowers. We have good data on honeybees. And then on everything else, these single bars basically just mean there's one study that might have looked at it in some place. So we don't have a lot of understanding of how this works across regions. So a lot of, in some ways, despite a lot of interest in pollination and the potential for other things, a reasonable amount of gap in our knowledge of understanding of these other organisms. I put this in because I wasn't sure what Arnon would say. There is some speculation, at least one study examining and making a case for a strong role of wind pollination. There are a lot of reasons to be a little bit skeptical about that, given the morphology of the flowers, the type of pollen that's there, but it is a potential, and at least some studies have raised that. So, but I would agree with the data in bulk that Arnon showed and that are here, that the dominant role is, to the best of our understanding, is going to be from insect pollination, mostly from bees. So what's the potential? So now I want to back away from avocado, not yet being an avocado pollination researcher like some of my colleagues, and just talk more generally about this interest. And the interest in other bees for pollination has grown rapidly for a couple of reasons. And so one reason is obviously the threats that are facing managed honeybees. Not that we always see a strong limitation on them, but the cost and the amount of effort involved in North America in trying to reliably manage honeybees has gone dramatically up over the last 2 decades. So a lot more challenges to keeping things going, beekeepers working a lot harder, and prices going up on the rental fees for those hives. So with the other bees that we see out there, there's a great potential out there. Bees are a very diverse group of organisms, over 3,000 species in 3,500 species in North America, probably 4,000 species, depending on how we count them. And looking at California itself, California is a center for diversity for bees in some ways in the nation, with recent estimates well over 1,600 species. So that doesn't mean all of these species are likely to be visiting avocado or visiting our agricultural areas, but nonetheless, there's a great potential. There's a lot of diversity out there, and especially in a crop like avocado, where the pollination seems to continue to be a bit of a vexing challenge to understand. Embracing the possibility of more diversified pollinators is a useful thing to be working towards. So some of the challenges with pollination from diverse organisms and from managed bees as well in agriculture are follow. And this is an aerial photograph flying through the Central Valley, and I call this challenge the irony of intensive agriculture and pollination. And that's where we are in California and many other places, where the areas of greatest demand for pollination are the areas in which we place the greatest challenges for managing and sustaining populations of those pollinators. So intensive agriculture needs a lot of bees. It has a high density of flowers on those crops, and they're grown in high densities spatially, the crops themselves, but the intensification also challenges bees, right? We use a lot of chemical pesticides to manage crop pests, which induces a lot of mortality as well as physical stressors on those bees and other insects that are not the target of the pesticides. We also do a good job at reducing the amount of forage that's available by simplifying those landscapes, and also simplifying that forage where we have large monocultures of flowering crops. The diversity in terms of nutrition of pollen and nectar is strongly diminished relative to more diversified areas. Focusing on the reduced habitat, which is where our project going forward is interested in looking at. Really, this reduced forage and habitat for wild pollinators other than managed honeybees results from the removal of native habitat and clean farming to remove weeds around borders and within flowering fields or orchards, and also this landscape level simplification, the move to increasingly large field sizes with less borders in the area, and a regional consolidation of the crops that we grow, so less diversity of the crops themselves. All these things together essentially do a couple of things. They reduce the overall flowering, and they also reduce the continuity of flowers that are available. So unlike managing honeybees, where we can move the managed hives, the boxes around, the wild bees that are there have to persist over time in the areas where their nests are, and their nests are located. And so this continuity of resources throughout the season is an important one. We know that wild bees can persist where their resource needs are met, and we know that honeybees benefit from diverse, high-quality forage. So I want to talk a little bit about what we then are doing or exploring in order to sort of meet these resource needs to promote populations and communities of these bees. So if we're thinking about how we can move the dial back a little bit or sustain the diversity of vegetation to support these bees. One of the main things we do is to plant or revegetate diverse native and non-native wildflower species, either in annual and perennial forb species or in woody vegetation like hedgerows, to support them. And really in doing this, even though this is about avocados and cultivation, there are really two goals in doing this if we look more generally. And the first is supporting forage for diverse wild and managed bees and other populations. So that's a biodiversity goal, and that's particularly useful as we see changes in the focus from the level of regulation at the state, et cetera, with endangered species and their listing. And then also the other goal will be obviously pollination, so enhancing pollination services to crops within these landscapes. And both we hope to achieve ideally from enhancing habitat and enhancing therefore the populations and communities of these non-managed bee populations. So what do we know about this? I'm gonna, again, sort of give some really brief summary of what's known from around the world. So again, there's some really nice recent summaries of the role that in enhancing natural habitats within agriculture areas can do. So native habitat benefits, again, biodiversity. But when we look broadly, it's much less clear that it consistently benefits pollination. Sometimes yes, and sometimes it's more equivocal, so we're not sure. And those comparisons are done in the following way. So this cartoon is showing you how we would do that scientifically in collaboration with growers and people in the practice in different areas. So essentially, we would be looking at one set of fields, and this could be avocado orchards, where there's an enhancement of the habitat along the edge, and then comparing the diversity of species that are supported along a similar edge, but that is not enhanced. So that tells us directly what the benefit might be for supporting biodiversity in those naturalized or enhanced areas, right? It's a comparison of enhanced with unenhanced edges. And that's how we look at the biodiversity benefit. To look at whether there's actually a improvement of the habitat on pollination, of course, we're looking at the same sort of context, but instead of focusing on what's going on with wild insect species diversity in the edges, we're now looking at what the visitation of the crop associated with those different kinds of edges is. So the comparison of an enhanced and unenhanced margin area or interior area, but looking at what's visiting the actual crop. And here, again, what I would say is with this pollination goal, the outcome of that is not so consistent. Sometimes, yes, there's a benefit, sometimes not. So I want to just give a case study where we've done a lot of work on this, and we've done no work on it on avocados. So full disclosure for my group up to date, it's all been on a variety of crops in the Central Valley where we don't grow avocado. And so we've looked over the years when we plant. This shows pictures of people managing and putting in hedgerows or flower vegetation and what the outcome is. And the question is, again, for the same system, for the same cropping systems, do wildflower mixes that are put in and the resulting habitat plantings that result from those wildflowers function in real landscapes in the two ways? So they improve support for biodiversity of wild bees, and do they increase the pollination of adjacent crops? So to study this, I'm going to show examples from 2 different crops because they represent crops that flower at different times of the year and are very different types of crops, right? So in the one case, watermelon, and in our region, that's watermelon mostly grown for seed production, so high value, high demand for pollination. And then the other, almond, again, high value crop, high demand for pollination, but not a summer blooming crop, instead of an early spring flowering tree crop. We studied that. There's a 3-county region around Sacramento, and the UC Davis campus in Colusa, Yolo, and Solano counties, and this just shows a map of where the different study orchards were located for this work. And in each case, we're always comparing biodiversity and pollination services in orchards or crop fields that had an adjacent wildflower planting to one that did not, to the control sites. And so what we do, we have teams of people that are sampling flowers on the borders, planted species and the associated weedy vegetation with them, and netting bees from flowers along transects in a controlled, timed way. And then for the crop visitation and yield metrics, we're measuring at various distances from where this enhancement might be along the edge and then into the interior of the blooming crop, assessing fruit density and fruit mass in the case of watermelon, and nut set in the case of almonds. I'll mostly just focus on the yield results, keep things reasonably tidy. If we look at the biodiversity value, cutting right to the chase, it shows a picture of the flowering crop borders and some of the species within them, both for watermelon and for almond. Looking at bee abundance and bee species richness in the borders, we see dramatic increases in the abundance of individuals of wild bees and the species richness that is supported. And in the case of almond, this is showing for multiple years, and in the case of watermelon, again, pooled across years. So a strong yes to biodiversity support from these plantings in these 2 cropping systems. In the case of the ecosystem service value, the pollination and yield of the crop, in watermelon, again, I'm going to show yield measured as fruit density along the row and yield mass together. Those give us a total metric of overall, yield of the product. And then in almonds, it's conversion of flowers to nuts that we see, so nut set in the same location. And again, in each case, the wildflower enhanced are in the diamonds and the controls are in the circles. And the basic take home is that the diamonds are higher than the circles, showing that in both cases, yes, we get significant improvement in yield as a result. So in this case, I think one of the interesting possibilities is in the same systems for 2 different crops to show that the dual goals that we have for those are met. I'll make one small tangent, which is that I said earlier, to support native communities or populations, we need to support the resource needs that they have. And although bees and some of these other organisms feed a lot on flowers, they don't only need food, they also need a place to live. And so one of the other things we've worked with, and I think is important to be considering, is their nesting needs. This shows a picture in the middle of the nests of sort of a typical ground nesting bees with little piles of earth, and then the tunnels going down into the ground with a wristwatch for scale. And then here's a cutaway we have of one of those nests where the tunnel goes down into the ground. The female is excavating and making a chamber that she's providing sort of a mass like a cookie dough, which is a mixture of pollen and nectar, on which she lays eggs and is providing that provision for the developing offspring. And they're going to complete most of their life cycle underground in these chambers. And that's true of many, many bees. So quite different from what we think about in honeybees and the pictures that Arnon showed of that lifestyle. So most of them are not social, they're nesting underground, and they need some place to nest. We've also looked at the potential for these wildflower plantings along borders to support improved nesting opportunities. We do that by essentially deploying, these are emergence tents that we deploy over the ground. At the end of the day, when the bees are in their nests, and then allowing the bees to emerge the following day, and then recording the number of bees that are trapped underneath these given areas. And we do this over the season to record nesting densities in control margins and margins that have wildflower plantings. This is a brand new paper out looking at this. So again, the take-home message is that nest density and bee richness in the nests are also significantly higher on wildflower borders. So the controls here over 3 years of study in both cases, in orange and in green, we see increases in density and the species richness of bees that are nesting in the borders as well. So let me close then. So again, my apologies for being a little bit light on the avocado, but hopefully that will change as we get into the research that we're doing in the next few years. So I've tried to sort of argue for a strong role of natural habitat generally, and we have good data for a variety of crops. For avocado, less so, and certainly avocado less so in the California context. So we're interested to know what the role of natural habitat and habitat enhancement in general is for avocado pollination. Does the planting of that habitat or the maintaining of that habitat around orchards benefit avocado pollination? And then also understanding more clearly what insects out there, which are those that are most effective as pollinators of avocado. We know some about visitation. I'll show you one really great pilot study that Ben Faber and Gordon Franke did to look at the visitors, but we don't really have data on doing a controlled comparison between enhanced and non-enhanced in the way that we would like. We're collaborating with other groups from UC Santa Barbara and Cal Poly Pomona to look at biodiversity. They have a separate project already looking at it. This just shows you a taste of what we have from this new study that's out from Gordon Franke and Ben, looking at the diversity of visitors visiting avocado flowers in Ventura, Santa Barbara region. So not that global synthesis, but really focusing in. And so the first is showing in the middle the relative proportions of families within these different insect orders. So flies, bees, wasps, and beetles. So there's some diversity of visitors at the family level. So large groups of these different organisms within the different broad types. If we focus just on the bees and just on the flies, which have the greatest diversity, there are 35 different species of bees that are seen visiting avocado from a variety of different bee families. And similarly for flies, 17 total species from a quite diverse set of different fly families that were collected visiting on these orchards. And I believe, Ben can correct me, but this is just a set of, in general, sort of three to four different orchards that were explored over multiple years, but still quite an interesting diversity. So going forward, this just shows some acknowledgement of the research team, Hamatal Cohen and Ben Faber, who are with UCA&R in the region, really helping to coordinate and keep things going on the study. Gordon Franke, who has done original work on this, and I didn't present his work on the wildflower plantings and their support for biodiversity, because that's really his work entirely and it's published. And then Arnon and Yael Mendelik, colleagues from Israel, who are doing similar parallel work in Israel and also really supporting us here. And again, reminding us that this study will be coordinating with Cal Poly Pomona and Santa Barbara, that are really focused on understanding the diversity of all sorts of organisms that are found in and around avocado groves in the region. So I will leave it there, and I'm happy to take questions if people have them.
Yeah, thank you. You opened up a whole Pandora's box. A general ecological set of questions. It's two-part, and it's from the standpoint of the avocado. here is a tree that is flowering and flowering and flowering, puts all of its resources into flowering. It can be covered with, it's yellow with flowers. You can't see any green leaves. What implications are that for pollination? And two, this is a tree that comes from the New World, and the honeybee comes from the Old World. How is the avocado adapted to the honeybee, or how is the honeybee adapted to the avocado? So it's a two-parter, but it focuses more on the avocado tree, not the arthropods.
Yeah, it's a great question. One has to ask when one sees a long-lived perennial plant that is producing huge numbers of flowers that are tiny flowers, and then results in a relatively modest proportion converted to fruit that are giant. I mean, it reminds me of cacao, right? Another tropical plant that seems to set relatively few fruits, but makes an enormous investment per fruit relative to flowers. And so that kind of, I would say, sexual strategy, right, is the perfect case. I mean, this is really pollination ecology nerding out, I guess I'd call it, rather than practical. But those are exactly the situations where we expect to see pollination limitation, which is quite likely what we're seeing, right? And that's where, rather than resources limiting pollination, the tree has invested a lot in trying to sort of, provide lots of opportunities for flowers to be set. So it's playing a game that's pollinator visitation is a very uncertain thing. So many opportunities with the many flowers to get pollination. I don't really have a sense, maybe Arnon does, about things like whether the trees are alternate bearing. So a lot of times in long-lived fruits where there's a lot of investment, we see years that are heavy fruit set followed by years that are low fruit set, but this drawn out and then combined with this really drawn out protracted flowering season where we see fruits only set in a very short window. It's really, to me, the challenge all makes sense. That doesn't mean I know what the answer is, but this is an unusual strategy, right? We see in many crops where exactly the opposite is happening. The flowering periods are short, they're synchronized, they're all happening together, and that's really more than norm. So it's a pretty unusual situation. With respect to the second question on honeybees, well, I mean, evolutionarily, yeah, the main pollinator that we use can't possibly have evolved with the plant, and so I think these studies from Brazil and other tropical New World places where we see stingless bees visiting the slides I showed back several earlier, the data that we have on other bees is a lot of the interesting data are from stingless bees, which we would expect to have some long history with this plant. Again, with bumblebees, I mean, Arnon has found, and others in Israel found, some considerable potential for bumblebee pollination, but again, it's quite unlikely that there's a long history evolutionarily of pollination of avocado by bumblebees, because bumblebees are a temperate group of insects. They're very unusual in tropics, so they're again not likely to be those bees. Yeah.
Okay, here's the summation of several questions that have come up pertaining to what you referenced in your Central Valley work. Here's an avocado tree that the honeybee does not like visiting because either the high potassium level in the nectar or whatever the causes are. Putting out a lot of diversity of resources for alternative pollinators. Is that a good idea? Is that going to detract from going to the avocado? And is alyssum good? And are we actually increasing not just pollinators, but biocontrol agents as well? So that's a big, this Pandora's box. You started it.
Yeah, I think the answer I would give is we hope we're doing all those things. So by increasing the diversity of flower forms, their flowering periods, et cetera, the goal really is to increase the potential for diverse pollinators to be visiting the orchards that are adjacent to them. And there's good data, like I said, from some cases, and in California, right, where when we do that, we see this spillover occurring. And so I think the potential of that is really useful. In terms of the biocontrol agents, and are we going to get these co-benefits in other ways? We've looked at that as well in some other cropping systems up in the valley and other places, and the answer is yes, we can. We don't always, but again, thinking about the flower very carefully about the design of flowers that we're promoting, so that we're providing resources for those particular insects is important. Like, we're not going to. So alyssum's a great example. I mean, it's likely to be a flower that could be quite useful to some biocontrol wasps where the nectaries are accessible, et cetera. So lots to do. Maybe I can make it part of the goal of our project to do a much more comprehensive review, and maybe we can talk in a year or so about what we can summarize from all these things in avocado, unless Arnon's already done that, which he might have in other places. But you know, the final thing you mentioned was the potential for competition between, you know, if we're planting all these things, are we competing and drawing insect visitors away? I don't know the answer in avocado. I posted in the chat earlier, actually, what do we know about the pollens that are collected by honeybee colonies that are in avocado when they're also visiting avocado? Are they collecting 1% avocado and, you know, 99% other things? This is a relatively straightforward thing to look at that would be pretty interesting to know. We would have a sense of what their preferences are across the blooming period of avocado, and maybe we already know that from historical literature, but I know in some other crops we see that. So the same problem we have in onion, right? Onion seed production, super valuable, and some of the best work I've seen on it comes out of New Zealand and Australia with you know, trying to look at flies actually, and where they may be less put off by some of the particular chemistries of flowers. The onion shares the same issues with avocados, or parallel issues, where the nectar contains, in that case, I think it's sulfur that's not, but maybe also potassium actually, that's high in the pollinators. The honeybees don't like it. They actively avoid it. So the stocking densities of honeybee hives are ridiculously high, 12, 15, 18 hives per acre stocking densities to get pollination in seed onion. So looks like Mary Lou has a question or a comment. Maybe that's probably a comment.
Yes. Well, yeah, of course, I have a comment. Everybody knows me, knows that I always have a comment. But I agree 100% with you. And I think that we have a living example of biodiversity in Farm ACW down in Fallbrook. Bill Arterberry and Reuben Hofsche advising Bill at Farm ACW many years ago, over 40 years ago, they started letting the wild mustard and radishes grow, and actually looking at the pollen that the bees were bringing into the hives, and knowing that it was primarily mustard and radish. But in years where there was low wildflowers, you would have a high propensity of avocado on honey. You could tell by the color of the honey, and we actually analyzed the honey for the prosaetol content, so we knew relatively that it was high in avocado honey. So it is possible to have this biodiversity and not take away from the bees visiting avocados.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think what we need to be thinking about too is slightly more sophisticated management. So if we're worried about competition, then maintaining early blooming things like, you know, mustards are blooming now, right? So very early flowering, but then, you know, potentially thinking about mowing back if it's within the economic feasibility, so that if you're, you know, and they may resprout later or not, depending, but managing the timing, you know, in a more nuanced way. Certainly, these are things that are going on in almond in the Central Valley. Now, you know, the system's not the same, the topography is not the same, but people are working towards that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so Yeah, and I would urge you that within this project, you need to visit San Diego County. It's a different beast than Ventura County and Santa Barbara County. And if you have cooperators from Cal Poly Pomona, you're only an hour away from Farm ACW, and I'd be more than happy to host you there. And it also goes back to what Arnon was talking about, having multiple pollinizers. Farm ACW also has had a long-standing strategy of having at least three pollinizers in every field. And you can see that in some years, the bacon flower is before the hass. Sometimes it's in sync. And every variety is sort of in different synchrony. So I really believe in the strategy of using multiple pollinizers if possible as well. And anyway, I could go on and on, but it's not my.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the comment. I mean, I'm obviously in your camp 100%, being someone who's interested in biodiversity, but recognizing the value of the managed crop biodiversity, even within a crop, is something that we've sort of moved increasingly away from, thinking that economically that's the way to go. And in the short term thinking, it could be, right? You have more Haas, that's the high value thing, and you're selling that. But I think one of the things we need to remember is that we are in times of unpredictable future in terms of climate. And this year people are saying, oh, it's really cold or it's really hot, and I have trees flowering early, and perhaps that happens every year. But what we want to do as researchers and an industry is have predictability of what do we know, and how does that predict what's going forward. And the reality is it is less predictable. We just have an increasingly difficult time of predicting what the next 2 years, the variability into year, the next 5 to 10 years, even less so. And we know when we look at other cropping systems, again, Mary Lou knows avocado, I do not in California, or Ben will know it too. But in other systems, that diversity of cultivars, that diversity of vegetation gives you stability when we have uncertainty of weather into the future. That is just true. So that's not debated. And so even though it seems like having only this one cultivar is good, at some point it may shift and it will not be. And I think it's useful to sort of admit that and move forward, boldly from that point. That's my soapbox, but I think at some point we're going to have to recognize it.
Yeah. Mary Lou, a question comes up. Is there some way to visit ACW?
Well, I mean, since Bill has passed away, I can do that, but I think definitely we should have Neil visit. And maybe if Neil visits, we can make an arrangement to visit some other avocado groves in the Fallbrook area, Temecula area. I think that would be really, really good when they're blooming. And because they bloom over a long period of time, we have ample opportunity for Neil to come down. So I can make the arrangements if we decide that that's what we want to do.
Questions come up. What are some good honeybee and native bee attracting plants? Gordon Franke has published 2 pieces that are available through University of California publications on plant species that are attracted to native bees. You can get that through the University of California publications. Neil, avocado orchards are thick with leaf mulch. An orchard may have 6 to 18 inches thick, 2 feet thick of leaf mulch. Should we be pulling leaf mulch away in order to allow for native bees to nest?
What an interesting question. I don't pretend to have the understanding of avocado to be able to answer that question, but one of the things about managing the ground underneath trees is that carbon and that organic matter that's being left there probably has other benefits, right? And so when we're thinking about managing for pollinators, whether they're fly, I mean, the other possible benefit of leaf mulch is that there's some flies whose life cycles probably are being completed in the leaf mulch, or they very well might be, depending on moisture. So I would say the caution would be about trying to focus on the benefit for one sort of function or one group at the detriment of the larger benefit that the mulch may provide. And my sense is, and it's not my area, that people probably already know who are working in avocado that leaving that organic matter has a long-term benefit for stabilizing soils on slopes and all the rest of it, which is why it's being added. So I don't think I would encourage that. I would, though, say, as we get an understanding of which other bees and flies are effective pollinators in these different contexts in the region, understanding where they are nesting or where we can promote their nesting that might be on borders would be a pretty great idea. So that we're also shepherding that side of their life cycle.
So in Australia, they've been encouraging putting out raw meat in bags to attract flies.
Yeah.
Is there any value in something like that?
I guess I don't actually know for avocado, obviously I have to say. The Australians have done that for onion as well. I will say that the other thing that from the literature in Australia that was pretty interesting was the animal manure, right? So again, one more plug for diversified agriculture, integrating other kinds of animals to manage vegetation through grazing appropriately, right? They leave behind their dung that is then used by some of those flies. And my understanding, again, I need to read them more carefully, but some of those species are using the dung. Arnon, you may be able to comment more fully on that, but again, one more value to integrating some, whether it's goats or sheep a little bit into the system could be pretty useful.